Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting of the Public Accounts Committee to order. As is our custom, I'd like to begin with a word of prayer and ask the member for East Ed, Mr. Isaac Rankin, to lead us in that prayer.
Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we come to you today asking for your guidance, wisdom, and support as we begin this Public Accounts Committee hearing. Help us to engage in meaningful dialogue on behalf of our people. Bless all those participating in this meeting. As we do this to your honor and your glory, we ask this in your Son's holy name. Amen.
Thank you, Mr. Rankin, and good morning to all members of the committee, including the Auditor General's Office and the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development. I'll get it right. We are quorate this morning, but we have had apologies from Ms. Wilkes, and also we've had indication from Mr. Seymour that he was running a few minutes late, but he will be here, so he will appear when he does get to the chamber. But we are quorate, and this committee can proceed to conduct its business and the hearing this morning. I would like to mention that from the Auditor General's office, the Auditor General herself is not unable to be here. She is not well this morning, but Ms. Angela Cullen, the Deputy Auditor General, is here in her stead. This morning, the report we are discussing is an update on past PAC recommendations, 2022 report number 2 that was issued in February of 2022. So this morning we are going to be looking at the report. I know I have that information to hand. Yeah, we're looking at customs this morning, and we have first up in our witnesses is Mr. Kenneth Jefferson, who is the Financial Secretary. He's going to be followed by Mr. Charles Clifford, the Director of Customs and Border Control, and then finally Mr. Wesley Howell, the Chief Officer in the Ministry of Border Control and Labour. Since the Financial Secretary is going to be here to be questioned, and this report itself was upon this follow-up report on past PAC recommendations was based on a report that was done at the time when I was Minister of Finance. I think it's only right and proper that I excuse myself from any line of questioning with regard to the Financial Secretary this morning. And so I will conduct the meeting, but the hearing, but will not engage in any discussion or a questioning of the Financial Secretary this morning. So that, I think, takes care of all of the housekeeping matters with regard to the hearing this morning. So I'm going to begin and kick off this. No, sir. I'm going to kick off this this hearing now by inviting the Deputy Auditor General to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Public Accounts Committee, officials from Ministry of Finance and the listening public. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity for me to make some opening remarks on the Auditor General's behalf, who again sends her apologies for not being here today. As Mr. Chairman introduced, the report we're considering is our follow-up on past PAC recommendations 2022, Report 2, quite a mouthful, that our office published in February this year. That report followed up on 54 previous PAC and OAG recommendations made in 3 separate reports. And as the Chairman has indicated, the hearing this morning is to look at customs in the Cayman Islands. Our office first published in May 2019 and the related PAC report from July 2020. Overall, our office and the committee made 20 recommendations on customs. Only 6 of those recommendations have been fully implemented almost 3 years later. However, there is a mixed picture. Customs and Border Control has fully implemented almost half of the recommendations assigned to it, and the Ministry of Finance has implemented a fewer number of recommendations, around 20%. Some important recommendations have yet to be implemented, and I'd like to give you some examples. The Ministry of Finance has not yet established a revenue unit, determined the full level of the tax gap, or finalised a concessions policy. Our office first recommended in 2015 that a revenue concessions policy be developed and approved, and at that time the Ministry of Finance committed to do this by December 2016. 5 years later, no revenue concessions policy has been put in place, although I understand that one has been drafted. Without such a policy, it's also not clear how Customs and Border Control can effectively monitor the goods being imported and ensure that appropriate revenues are being collected. It is pleasing that Customs and Border Control has now published its strategic plan, but it has not yet developed a supporting workforce plan or updated its workforce rules. It is concerning that almost 3 years after making the recommendation to put in place effective project management for the new Customs IT Modernization Project, that CBC has not yet done so. That's all I'm going to say as opening remarks. I have with me here today Mr. Adrian Morenzi, who supported me in preparing the report, and we're happy to support the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Auditor General. Since the Financial Secretary is present in the chamber at this time, I'll just proceed to introduce things and to kick off the, invite members to kick off the line of questioning. It's been some 3 years since the Office of the Auditor General report on customs in the Cayman Islands was published. The OAG's report included 15 recommendations. The PAC endorsed these and made 5 more in its July 2020 report. All 20 recommendations were accepted, and 11 were directed to the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development. It is disappointing to note that the Ministry has only implemented 2 of the recommendations. 2 others have been partly implemented. The Ministry has plans to implement 4, but has not yet actioned or started those, and has made little or no progress on the remaining 3. And therefore, the Office of the Auditor General assessed the Ministry's progress as red, limited progress. The first area that we wish to examine and question the Financial Secretary on is the area of the revenue budget. And for that, I turn to Member for Georgetown West, Ms. Barbara Connolly, to conduct the questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, good morning to everyone. I will kick off the questioning this morning. First, by speaking to the revenue budget. In 2019, the OEG, the Auditor General's report, reported the need for MFED's revenue unit to ensure that its process for preparing the revenue budget includes reasonable forecasts and assumptions that these are documented to provide an adequate audit trail for changes, review, discussions, including with Customs and Border Control, and approval. We note from your February 2022 response that the revenue unit will be expanded to include 2 additional staff members who will assist with fully implementing this recommendation. My first line of questioning is, can the Financial Secretary state whether the 2 additional staff members were recruited?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and through you, good morning to you and the committee members and members from the Auditor General's office. Excuse me. Mr. Chairman, the revenue unit.
Can I just ask you, for the record, just state your name and position?
Yeah, sure, thanks. Kenneth Jefferson, Financial Secretary and Chief Officer in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as probably everyone will know in this chamber, in this committee, the revenue unit has for the longest of times consisted of one individual. And that is not a desirable position, but it has worked reasonably well in past years. And Member Conley is quite right in that the response from the Minister of Finance in February spoke about the expansion of the revenue unit into to include more individuals. The answer is that, to her question, is that the two additional persons that are envisaged to join the unit have not been recruited, but certainly the approval for those posts have been received, so we have approval for those posts to come into being in 2022. We've budgeted for those salaries, those costs in 22's budget, and we're developing now a job description on those two particular posts. We are very hopeful that we would have the recruitment process started certainly by the summer of this year, and to have those two additional persons in the course of 2022 as a part of the revenue unit.
Thank you, Financial Secretary. So do you anticipate then that those two individuals then will be in office by the end of 2022?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you, certainly that is the plan.
Okay, can the Financial Secretary say what progress has been made to ensure that the revenue budget includes reasonable forecasts and assumptions with input from Customs and Border Control? So my question also is this being worked on, and can you give us some indication of when that will actually take place in terms of including forecasts and assumptions in the budget?
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to Member Conley. Mr. Chairman, we do start with an admission that perhaps the formulation of the revenue budget, the assumptions that are used in arriving at revenue numbers may not, may not always be documented, but the process of liaising and contacting with particularly Customs Department as well as the Ministry of Financial Services on financial services related revenues, that liaison, that coordination, that contact does actually take place and has done for many years. Where we fall down may have been in the recording of those assumptions and so forth, but the coordination has taken place, and what it typically involves is that the one individual in the revenue unit will have his estimate as to what the revenues will be for a forthcoming budget period, and those estimates that the revenue unit has are compared to those from Customs and Border Control, those from SEMA-related revenues, those from the Registrar of General's offices. So there is considerable coordination between them. We do admit that the documentation of those relationships may not always be recorded, but it does take place. And I do also understand, we do also understand the point that the Audit Office has made in the past, which is that the revenue estimates, when viewed in relation to end-of-year actual revenues, the revenue estimates then tend to look understated. And you get the case consistently that actual revenues are exceeding budgeted revenues. And we fully understand what that then leads to, which is that we have to then fix our expenditures to match our revenues, to leave a gap then for some surplus to exist. But the point made is, well, if your revenues were more realistic in relation to what it actually turns out to be, your expenditures for the course of the year could be a bit higher, and you still have a surplus, and the higher expenditures would avoid the need then for, in the course of the year, quite a few rounds of supplementary expenditures. That would disappear and would go if the revenues estimates were higher and realistic. You could budget better for the realistic expenditure numbers. We do admit that, you know, that is a valid point that the audit office has made in the past years. So certainly it is you know, a great need that the revenue estimation gets better and better and better for the purposes of, certainly for expenditure. We want, you know, our expenditure levels to be realistic. So the work will continue, and we are hopeful with the additional 2 persons that we plan to employ, that those revenue estimates will be better. Continued liaison with customs and in particular financial services related fees.
Good morning, Mr. Jefferson. As a follow-up to your answer to Member Parliament Conley, when you speak about being very conservative in the revenue forecast, this has been year on year and 2-year forecast when it moved to that point. But is there any specific reason why we can't get it more accurate then? Because again, as you mentioned, you get better at forecasting, you also get better at also predicting your expenditure. And then it will save a lot of time back in Finance Committee. So is there any particular reason why we can't get better at it?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you. Thank Member Rankin for that question. It may simply come down, Mr. Chairman, Member Rankin, to human nature. Individuals would prefer to exceed their budget predictions when it comes to revenues, as opposed to falling short. It may simply be human nature that leads us into that direction. But I think with you know, better coordination with Customs, Border Control, SEMA, and Registrar of Companies, the use of more individuals coming on, better technology, use of data, that they will get, the estimation will get better. And we should see the budgeted revenues being closer to actual revenues once a particular financial year has come and gone. That is what I can think of right now in terms of reasons why it has been budgeted revenues have consistently been less than actual revenues.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, thank you and good morning. Good morning to everyone. Mr. Chair, I wanted to ask the Honorable FS, just trying to dig in a little deeper into what Honorable MP Rankin mentioned in terms of what is the trend. I know we had two years of that were unusual, the last 2 years. But before that, can you enlighten the House, if you do have the information, of the trend in terms of trying to get more accurate? I know people like to be conservative in terms of budgeting, but is there a situation where the trend has always been that we have outperformed what we had budgeted? Then was there an appetite to nudge it up another 5% or another 10%? I'm trying to understand how you approach it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank Member Seymour for his question. I think, Mr. Chairman, the honest answer is that over the years, governments, present and past, have tended to be conservative and deliberately wanting to be conservative in their revenue estimation. We've been in government, in budget meetings where, because expenditure levels were higher than desired, there was the thought that went through persons' minds of, well, if our revenues were higher, we could afford more expenditures, a greater level of expenditure. But consistently, I believe, Mr. Chairman, that governments have said we want to be conservative in our revenue estimates, and we want to abide by those in the event that something goes wrong, and we're not building a greater level of expenditure than our budgets or than our revenues can afford. Mr. Chairman, the first quarter of 2022 has recently finished, and we obviously published the first quarter report, financial report of the government for January to the 31st of March in the Gazette, and that was done on the 11th of May, which indicated revenues for that first quarter compared to revenues in 2021, 2020, 2019, and compared it with the budget for 2022. And it is the case that the March numbers for the first quarter were in excess of what was budgeted for that quarter. And that is consistently the case. But if I have in front of me, and I won't dwell on it too long, Mr. Chairman, the results for January to April 2022, which would have been discussed in Cabinet yesterday when the Minister for Finance took the report there. And I just say quickly that as an indication, the first 4 months of this year, so ended 30th of April, our actual revenues of government were approximately $509 million. The budget expectation for those 4 months was approximately $490 million. So we're talking a positive variance, revenues exceeding budget by about $20 million. Compare April 2022, $510 million in revenue. Compare that with the same period in April 2021. It was $464 million, so quite a bit higher. If you go back to 2020, it was $376 million for that 4-month period in 2020. And in 2019, so this is a pre-COVID era, the revenues for the first 4 months of 2019 were $428 million. So $428 million in 2019 versus $510 million in 2022. So quite an increase there. So the answer to your question, Member Seymour, is that the trend has been, certainly in the earlier portions of a financial year, of a fiscal year, for revenues to exceed our budget expectations. And as the year progresses, we find that positive variance on the revenue side generally tends to fall away. There are exceptions, Mr. Chairman, as you know, that for example, in 2020, I think it was when the private fund fees were introduced. That was a major blip, and it was a windfall for the government for 2020 and in 2021 as well. So, but the general trend has been that over the years, revenues actually have exceeded the budget expectations.
Good morning. Financial Secretary. Moving on with the revenue concessions and policy. We note that in 2019, the Auditor General's reported that the government needed to develop a formal concessions policy, and the Public Accounts Committee recommended in 2020 that this recommendation should be implemented as soon as possible. And we note from the 2022 responses that MFED planned to liaise with the Minister for Finance to present the existing draft revenue concession policy to caucus by 30th of April 2022. Question to the Financial Secretary. What are the reasons for the delays in having an approved concession policy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank Member Borden for her question. And Mr. Chairman, I would say to start with that efforts to conclude a revenue concession policy has been around for quite some time. Unfortunately, it has spanned a number of administrations. Mr. Chairman, I have Mr. Michael Nixon with me, who is a Senior Assistant Financial Secretary in the Ministry, who has been key in developing the policy, the draft policy that we have now. And I'd certainly would like to give him an opportunity to speak to it. I suspected, Mr. Chairman, that this would be, a question that the committee would rightly ask. So I prepared a one-page chronology of events, and I won't dwell on it very long because I know time is pressing. What I would say very quickly, just to give the listening public a flavor for the efforts over the years. The policy first went, the revenue concession policy, and elaborating briefly for the public. The policy is a document that's to aid the government of the day in deciding whether to grant a request for a concession on revenue, either an outright gift of revenue being foregone, import duty, stamp duty, a reduction of those revenues is another possibility, or a deferral of those revenues being collected. They're all examples of concessions. So the policy is a guide to a government of the day to say this is what you may wish to apply in making a decision on a request that you're facing. And the policy was first went to caucus in November 2016. So that would have been the government of the day from 2013 to 2017. It went there in November 2016. Of course, shortly after that, we had the May elections, the May 2017 general election. And on the 29th of June, 2017, I asked the then Minister for Finance, Mr. Chairman, which would have been you, if it was okay to send the policy to the new government caucus. We did that. The Minister of Finance got a presentation slot to the caucus in September 2019, and the presentation was made. And the caucus had requested certain changes and refinements to the draft policy. So that was late in 2019. On the 4th of March, Mr. Chairman, 2020, you asked me to make the finalization of the policy a priority for 2020. You asked me to do that. So that was March 2020. Of course, we all know, unfortunately, COVID-19 came, shut the islands down, and that really destroyed, in 2020, much of an opportunity for caucus to meet and to finalize the policy. And COVID-19 matters took precedence over the finalization of the revenue concession policy. We had the election in April 2021. Ministry of Finance was given a slot for a presentation in October 2021. The presentation was deferred from its October intended date. It did not happen. The current Minister for Finance was sent in February this year, 2022, at his request. He was sent the draft policy that was to have been presented to caucus in October 2021. And the reason for him doing that is to say that he wanted to restart the process of discussion with his current caucus. Just fast forwarding a bit, Mr. Chairman, on the 2nd of May of this year, the Minister for Finance told me that a committee consisting of the Premier, the Minister for Finance, Minister Andre Ebanks, PSC member Ms. Catherine Ebanks-Wilkes, and the Chief of Strategy, Ms. Pilar Bush. That committee was developing a policy, and it should be done by the 31st of May. I spoke to the Minister for Finance this morning before the session started here, and I asked him about the date of the 31st of May. He said to me that the 30th of June this year would be a more realistic date for a finalization of the policy. Mr. Chairman, I've said quite a bit, and I'd ask if Mr. Nixon wanted to say anything more. I think to answer the member's question in rounding it off, it would be that, efforts were made to finalize the policy. Competing priorities took place over many administrations, and the policy, I guess, kept getting lesser priority over something else, and it has shifted and drifted over a long period of time.
Mr. Nixon, do you have anything that you'd like to add, sir?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Michael Nixon, Senior Assistant Financial Secretary. Mr. Chairman, I think Mr. Jefferson has eloquently covered the chronology of events related to the policy. One of the things I would add is, in the interim, while there's not a comprehensive revenue policy document, the Minister of Finance does process revenue concession requests, and we've incorporated a number of the recommendations that have been made by the Auditor General's office over the years. So, for instance, if once a decision is made to grant a revenue concession, whether that be an outright waiver or reduction, the approval letters coming out are very, very specific. We know the entity or the individual. We know exactly what the waiver relates to, the amount, and there's an expiration date for when that waiver is valid for. Thank you.
Ms. Heather.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. Moving on now to the approval letters. The Auditor General also reported that approval letters awarding concessions needed to clearly specify the total value of concession awarded types of goods covered by the concession, expiration date, any secondary beneficiaries to be covered by the concession, and any related conditions. We note from your response in 2022 that this recommendation has been addressed. However, the Office of the Auditor General could not verify this as the sample concession approval letters you proved covered specific invoices only, rather than wider concessions like those awarded to developers. Can the Financial Secretary give an assurance that approval letters for larger concessions clearly specify the total value of concessions awarded, types of goods covered by the concession, expiration date, any secondary beneficiaries to be covered by the concession, and any related conditions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would like Mr. Nixon to address those valid points that Member Borden just raised, because Mr. Nixon's heads a section of staff in the Ministry of Finance that is involved with considering requests for revenue concessions coming to us. So I'd ask him to address those points that Member Borden just raised.
Mr. Nixon.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we do, when approval letters are granted, they are granted with those specific elements included, the individual or the entity who has been granted the concession, what specifically the concession is for, the value of the concession, the time period that the concession is valid for. I think over the issue that the Auditor General found in the most recent update to this report is that over the last couple of years, there have not been any large developer concessions. What we're seeing are more individual type things, which are very, very specific. Somebody has applied for, just use an example, concession on a vehicle. It may come from a church or a charity or an individual. And so you get very, very specific letters that are done. But we have not processed or approved any large recent developer concessions.
Ms. Connolly, I think you had a question. I think you may wanted to go back just to another area that
yes,
we
sir.
covered. Go
Mr.
ahead.
Chairman, sorry about that. I just want to go back to the revenue concession policy. Financial Secretary, you stated that a committee is actually going to be set up again to deal with this the revenue concession policy. So are you all not going to work from the existing policy, or is this a new policy that will be developed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank Member Conley for the question. Yes, I understand obviously what you're asking, Member Conley. I think when the current Minister for Finance asked for the policy to be given to him, which we did, that was for this purpose of using the existing draft policy that we developed in the Ministry of Finance with some changes over the past years by comments from past caucuses. He was using the current draft that we gave him as a starting point, as a foundation for developing the policy which the current government would be comfortable with. And the committee already exists to answer Mrs. Member Connolly's question. So the committee is not a committee that the Ministry of Finance is about to establish. The Minister for Finance has said that the committee already exists, consisting of the Premier, the Minister for Finance, Minister for Financial Services, Minister Andre Ebanks, and MP Ms. Catherine Ebanks-Wilkes, and the Chief of Strategy in the Premier's office, Ms. Pilar Bush. That group of individuals are the present committee, which I believe then has taken the draft policy that Ministry of Finance has produced as a starting point to, and I'm sure it's not going to be the case that every single component of that draft policy is going to get used, but I imagine that some of it is going to get used in what they produce. Mr. Chairman, it's a big document, but if it's helpful, we have copies of the draft policy that Finance produced on hand. We could leave those with the committee, but I can't say that the end result will be the draft policy that we have now, but we certainly have them on hand enough that we could distribute hard copies to the members. Mr. Chairman, if I could just beg your indulgence very quickly to say that in respect of what Mr. Nixon was just speaking to a few minutes ago, in the first quarter financial report for 2022, there is a very simple page inserted in there about the extent of revenues foregone in that first quarter. But those, Mr. Chairman, those revenues are revenues that the Ministry of Finance itself has become involved with, or is involved with, and has processed. And in a discussion with the audit office, we certainly thought that that number was on the low side. And in a discussion this morning, it certainly is the case that the concessions granted to large developers are not in the Ministry of Finance produced number. So I just wanted to be very, very clear and very honest with that, in that what the first quarter financial report for the government shows are revenues processed by the Ministry of Finance, but there are significantly more concessions processed by, in particular, by Customs and Border Control, which we have not included in our number. So I know, not wanting to make hot water for a fellow civil servant, but I know that Mr. Clifford is coming behind. That may be an area the committee may wish to speak to.
Mr. Rankin? No. Barbara.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Financial Secretary, that would be helpful if you could all receive a copy of the draft concession policy for our edification. Thank you.
You don't have to distribute it now, FS. We can do it before you leave. Thanks a lot. Mr. Rankin, you had questions.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Nixon, this question is for you pretty much because you elaborated on the concessions for developers. So can you say when was the last time a concession was made to a large developer? How long ago? Or how recent?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, unfortunately, I don't have those specific details with me, but when we talk about large developers in our context, we're referring particularly to large property developers who are seeking multi-year concessions. And if memory serves me correctly, the last large one would have been in 2018.
Thank you, sir. And I guess either you or Mr. Jefferson could answer this next question. On the existing concessions that weren't reported in the revenue or the budget, they're the ones that goes back 2018 and before, correct?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, just to clarify, the statement that was made by Mr. Jefferson earlier when he talked about what was excluded, the reference there to what is excluded would be large multi-year concessions that are not tracked by the Ministry of Finance. So I give you an example. We have some concessions that are valid for 20 plus years, and that concession may have awarded the developer a certain amount of import duty. That import duty management and processing happens at the Customs Department. So the approval of the concession would have stated a maximum amount and a time period, but we in the Ministry of Finance don't see the day-to-day processing. So we can't speak with certainty to say 500,000 was processed this year or this month. That information would have to come directly from Customs.
Thank you, sir.
Ms. Heather.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Moving on to the conditions of concession, and again to the Financial Secretary. The Auditor General's Office also reported that the need for MFED to ensure that approved concessions are validated, monitored, and reported upon. The Public Accounts Committee recommended that the government requests all recipients of concessions to provide regular updates on any conditions of concession awarded. The government should then monitor progress against these conditions and follow up with concession recipients as necessary. We note from your response in 2022 that MFED provides details of concessions awarded in its annual report. However, whether MFED validates or monitors the assertions in concession application requests to ensure compliance with any conditions attached to approved concessions is not clear. Can the Financial Secretary give assurance that conditions of concessions are being monitored and reported?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank Member Borden for her question. Just had a quick conference with Mr. Nixon, and I'm going to ask him to address the question, albeit to say that there has not been many of these types of concessions awarded recently in which monitoring of promises were necessary, but I'll ask Mr. Nixon to please elaborate.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, as Mr. Jefferson just stated, in recent years, being probably the last 5 years, 4 or 5 years, we have not seen very many concessions that have been approved by the Cabinet or by the Minister that have had significant conditions attached. Where there are conditions attached, our office does monitor them and work with the recipient to make sure that we receive or that those conditions are being met in order that the concession, that they can benefit from the concession.
I thank you very much for that response.
Mr. Rankin?
Yeah. Just a follow-up to your answer, Mr. Nixon. What happens if they are not meeting the conditions outlined in the concessions?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, if there is a recipient of a concession that is not meeting their whatever subjectivities, whatever conditions are attached, then that would trigger either they would no longer continue to receive that benefit, or it can actually trigger debt collection in terms of if they have benefited, the government, depending upon the condition that was approved, would be able to seek recovery of what benefit has been awarded.
Thank you. And then just following on to that answer, has the government had to go down that road?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, no, we have not had to during my tenure.
Thank you.
Ms. Connolly?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chairman, to Mr. Nixon. I have a question regarding the conditions when these concessions are granted. Say, for instance, a developer, right? And one of the conditions is that they employ a certain amount of Caymanians to work on a development site. Who monitors that, and who ensures that that actually occurs? That is where I have an issue sometimes, and I think we need some clarity on how that works.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, thank Member Connolly for that question. We have noticed in the Ministry of Finance, we've had a couple of examples several years ago where there were conditions attached to a concession which related to the monitoring of labor. Those specific conditions were provided that the recipient of the concession, in this case a developer, had an obligation to report that to the Department of Labor and Pensions. I have not seen a condition that they must employ. What I've seen is wording to the effect that they make every effort to employ Caymanians and that they report the breakdown of their labor, whether Caymanian, non-Caymanian, that are working on their jobs, that they report that to the Department of Labor and Pensions. I am aware of one developer who has that condition and continues to report to us on a monthly basis the breakdown of their labor, and in that case, that developer has, like I said, they continue to report to us monthly, and we are aware of the percentage of Caymanian labor that is provided on that job.
Should not be the same for every developer that has that condition under the concession, their concession? That be monitored and to ensure that they are following the concession that they've been granted?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, these are some of the exact points, Member Connolly, that we would hope to be addressed comprehensively in the concession policy and in a concession agreement. So in one of our recommendations is that where you have a large developer or a large concession, and whether that be a labor requirement or some other type of requirement, that we ensure that that's captured in a development or in a concession agreement, and that concession agreement would clearly articulate what the repercussions were if you did not make that criteria. Thank you.
Any other questions on this area? If not, then we will move on to the next area, which is titled the tax gap. For that line of question, I turn to Mr. Rankin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for the listening public, when we speak about the tax gap, what we're speaking about, it refers to the difference between the total amounts of taxes owed to the government and the actual amount received. Through you, Mr. Chair, to the Financial Secretary, in 2019, the Auditor General reported that the Ministry of Financial and Economic Development did not know how much revenue was potentially lost to government because it did not calculate the extent of the tax gap. That recommendation first said that the ministry should also identify the extent of the tax gap and take appropriate actions to close it. Later on, for the March 22, there was some figure for foregone revenues, and the question I want to ask is then how much progress have been made, and what are the plans to identify and monitor and report on the tax gap?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank Member Rankin for his question. Mr. Chairman, just for the benefit of the listening public, I'll just repeat, I think, essentially what he said. The tax gap is an indication of the extent to which revenues which would otherwise accrue to government, those revenues have been foregone, either deliberately by the government awarding concessions, or sadly, if members of the public, business entities somehow evade paying government revenues, it would be another cause for a loss of revenue to the government. But the tax gap is, and it's usually expressed as a percentage of government's revenues. The tax gap is the amount of revenues that the government has foregone, that it knows about, and it's happy to do so, as a percentage of the government's revenues for a particular financial year. I thank the Auditor General's office for sending a link to a recent article by the UK, in which for their, I think it was 2019-2020 fiscal year, their tax gap was about 5.3% in the UK. In terms of progress here in the Cayman Islands, Mr. Chairman, essentially we have just started. We spoke about including in the March first quarter financial report a page that showed revenues foregone, and we're back to where we were before, in that those are revenues that the Minister of Finance knows about, but there are other revenues foregone that we don't process, and I think certainly the CBC would be a good source of that knowledge. So if I were to take the revenues foregone that the Minister of Finance knows about, for example, in 2021, from our annual report, Minister of Finance annual report, those are about 7.5 million, and a huge portion of those would have been for, valid and laudable programs such as giving first-time Caymanian property owners a concession on their stamp duty. That would be a big portion of that 7.5 million. There's others elements as well. The award of import duty concessions that the Minister for Finance gets asked about directly. Typically, it's a church, a non-charitable organization saying, "We want to bring in a bus. Can you give us a break on the import duty? We want to buy furniture for our church or school. Can you give us a concession?" And they write to finance directly, and we say yes or no. So in 2021, the finance controlled revenue foregone numbers were 7.5 million approximately, Mr. Chairman, and the revenue for 2021 was around $961 million. So that would be a tax gap of around 1%, versus the UK's 5.3%. But we do admit that 1% number is too low. It is going to be higher than that, because there are parts of the revenue concession number or revenue foregone number that we don't quite know in the Ministry of Finance, and it does involve, or it will involve, getting the coordination process better between finance and in particular CBC to get that unknown element to add to the parts that we know about in finance. So it's early progress, Member Rankin, in terms of getting started on it, and it certainly is an area that needs further work, and we expect that number, the 1% that I mentioned, would probably get higher. And the recommendation obviously speaks to closing the gap, but I think that is more a matter for the cabinet or the caucus of an administration to decide about how to close the gap, as opposed to the Ministry of Finance. Because closing the gap either means you do away, the government of the day do away with some of the programs, and you're not going to award first-time Caymanian purchasers, property purchasers, a stamp duty break anymore, which I don't think any government has in mind to do. Closing the gap would involve making decisions like that, or introducing new taxes to get new revenues into government might be a way of closing the gap. But so I think the best that the Minister of Finance and CBC can do is to come up with a more comprehensive number for revenues foregone by government in the course of a year, and let that number be known to caucus and cabinet, and they make a decision as to whether they're happy to continue on with that level of concession or not.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson.
Ms. Conley, you have a question? Any other questions from members on this section? We'd like to turn our attention then to the next topic, and that is duty rates on alcohol. And for that, I'll turn to Ms. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to the Financial Secretary. And duty rates on alcohol. In 2020, the PAC stated that it was concerned that duty rates are outdated and those used for alcohol and fuel are not based on appropriate measurement, as duty is calculated on volume rather than value. The PAC recommended that the government review duty rates to be paid and specifically considers basing alcohol and fuel duty rates on value rather than volume. My first question is, why have we used this method of calculating duty rates on volume rather than value on alcohol? That's my first question.
Mr. Chairman, just conferring briefly with Mr. Nixon. The honest answer is that it is a legacy issue. I don't think that there's been any deliberate decision by a government in recent times to choose basing the duty on volume rather than rates. That hasn't been done. There hasn't been a change to that effect in recent times. So it's an inheritance, it's a legacy issue, and obviously it doesn't seem to happen very often in current times, but basing duty on value as well, I think most people have in mind that is automatically going to give a higher level of revenue for the government because the value is higher. In the rare, I'm just playing devil advocate and trying to create a comprehensive answer. In the rare times of values falling, then the government revenues would fall, as opposed to if it was based on volumes and the volumes were steady or they were even increasing, would be something to consider. But that seems not to be the case in very much recent years. So I can't answer the member's question other than to say it's been that way for quite some time, and it's not a deliberate decision in recent times to move to basing duty on volume of imports for alcohol and fuel as opposed to value of alcohol and fuel. That's a long-standing situation. I note that the update that members would see in front of it was that the government had accepted a private member's motion to change that basis. I can't say what the latest standing is on processing or progressing that private member's motion into reality of presenting a a revision to the Customs Tariff Law Act. PAC members will also know that we have the situation in which now the Customs Tariff Act can be changed by the Cabinet as opposed to the longer process of coming to Parliament. So the Cabinet could change the basis of calculating.
So as a result of the Auditor General's office making this recommendation, do you all think you would consider implementing this recommendation?
Mr. Chairman, I can certainly revisit with the Minister for Finance the recommendation, and to also remind the government, the caucus, of its acceptance of this private member's motion to do so. I can certainly do that. And will do so, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rankin, you have questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. As this was discussed in Public Accounts Committee in 2020, I think very robustly, do you know if any analysis, or is there any intention of any analysis being done on this very same topic of duty volume versus value?
Mr. Chairman, through you, Mr. Nixon and I are not aware of any analysis being done recently. I think it's simply resting on the knowledge and the belief and the facts that the value is increasing for these imports, and so if you're basing your duty, import duty rates on value, then you're going to get a higher level of revenue. So I think it's based on the everyday knowledge that we experience in everyday life, that the values are tending to increase as opposed to decrease.
Mr. Seymour.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to just go a little further with that FS. In your professional opinion, and knowing what you know in terms of the value increasing, would you, in advising about the 2020 approval by the Parliament or the LA at the time, in trying to move to this direction? Because sometimes we have appetites to go in a lot of areas, and we think that is the way to go, and when you investigate it, you find out that there's some things that we were missing and not calculating. What's your professional, would you advise the government to move in this direction?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, through you, and thank Member Seymour for his question. I think obviously the logical and sensible way to go about considering such an issue, Mr. Chairman, would be for the government, i.e. the Ministry of Finance and Customs and Border Control, to do the analysis, to do a calculation that essentially says, if we continue doing as we've always done for very many years, and we base our import duty on alcohol and fuel on volume, here's the revenues that we have obtained. And there can be some future estimation about what volumes in the future years may be as well. That gives you one scenario of revenues based on volume. We can then move and compare that to a second scenario in which we don't base it on volumes, but we base it on values. So we would go, for example, to the Economics and Statistics Office and ask for approximate values for alcohol and fuel over a long period of time, and calculate the import duty based on values as opposed to volumes, and to compare those two streams, and to then make a decision as to whether, one stream, the value, basing on value, is always consistently going to give you more revenues for the government, and therefore that is the way to go. That would be the comparison that would have to be made. In respect of an earlier question, I haven't seen that analysis. But I think the conclusion that came in the form of accepting the motion was, well, this is what we're experiencing in our day-to-day lives, that these prices are going up. And so if you base it on value, then you can expect to get more revenue for the government. But I've not seen that analysis, that comparison documented.
If there are no other questions, I think that this concludes the questioning of the Financial Secretary and Mr. Nixon. Gentlemen, I thank you all for attending the Public Accounts hearing this morning, and I will excuse you both at this time, and wish you all a good day. Thank you very much. Can we just take a 2-minute break before I call the next witness? Thank you, members, for getting back on time. Let's proceed now with the examining our next witness. I'd like to call the Director of Customs and Border Control, Mr. Charles Clifford, invite him to enter the chamber at this time. Right there is fine, sir. Mr. Clifford, I welcome you to the Public Accounts Committee hearing this morning, sir. It's been 3 years since the Office of the Auditor General report on customs in the Cayman Islands was published. The OAG's report included 15 recommendations. The PAC endorsed these and made 5 more in its July 2020 report. All 20 recommendations were accepted, and 9 were directed specifically to Customs and Border Control. We note that the CBC has implemented 4 of the recommendations, partly implemented 2, and has made little or no progress on the remaining 3. We are pleased, the committee is pleased, that some progress has been made in implementing the recommendations, but noted that the OAG, the Auditor General, assessed CBC's overall progress as amber, some progress. So in light of that preamble, I am going to open the questioning, looking first of all at the CBC's Workforce Plan. And Mr. Clifford, I would ask you if you would state before you answer your first question, just state your name and position for the record. And to open up the line of questioning first, I'm going to turn things over to Ms. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to Mr. Clifford. Thank you for attending this session today and your team. My first question is, as the chairman alluded to, Customs and Border Control Workforce Plan. In 2019, the OEG reported that Customs did not have a workforce plan, setting out what staffing it needs to deliver its objectives and goals. The OEG recommended that Customs and Border Control should develop a workforce plan that aligns with its strategic priorities. We note from your response to the OEG report in December 2021 that you plan to develop a workforce plan and you were recruiting additional HR staff in place to place the requisite focus on completing it. So my first question is, what progress has been made with an indicative time scale for developing a workforce plan?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Charles Clifford, Director of Customs and Border Control. And I thank the member for her question. Mr. Chairman, I think it's important that we put in context where we are at this point and how we got here. So, when this report was originally written on customs in the Cayman Islands, it was, of course, for the Customs Department. And that was prior to the merger of the Customs and Immigration Department, which occurred on the 1st of February 2019. Mr. Chairman, we had 2 HR employees in the Customs Department. When we merged the 2 agencies, we essentially doubled the size of the department. We were at 164 as a Customs Department, and we are now in the region of 270 275, I think, as Customs and Border Control. So since the merger, the HR team has been extremely stretched. We were expecting the same 2 HR employees to deal with a department that was essentially double the size. And there were many challenges that they had to deal with. There were many priorities that they had to deal with. The good news is that we have recently staffed the department, and we are now at 5 employees within CBC's HR section or unit. Mr. Chairman, I say that to say that we expect that we can now move forward with significant progress on this item. But the other important point I want to make on this is that in relation to recommendation number 1, which is that CBC should develop a strategic plan. That strategic plan, which is a 5-year plan, is now in place. And one of the deliverables under that will in fact be the development of a workforce plan. So it's not an ad hoc approach, Mr. Chairman. It is laid out very clearly in the plan. And as we move forward now with the implementation of the plan, we are confident that we will be able to achieve this objective and this recommendation. I believe, Mr. Chairman, that we will make significant progress on this between now and the end of the year. And the workplace plan must reflect not just our strategic priorities, but we recognize within our strategic plan that we have to be flexible for changing circumstances. Mr. Chairman, we all know what we've been through with COVID-19. It changed a lot of things for just about everyone. And it also, and I know that it's easy to use this as an excuse, but the truth of the matter is we all know what we had to deal with COVID-19. And it reset our priorities for two years during this period. And that was, for a very long period of time, a big part of our focus in terms of managing that. So that too had an impact. But I just say that to say that in our strategic plan, we know that there has to be a certain amount of flexibility for changing circumstances. I think that's all I want to say on that for the time being, and I hope that I've answered the member's question.
Thank you, Mr. Clifford. So are you providing us with some assurance then that there will be some progress on this workforce plan, or it should be sort of completed by the end of the year, or at least partially completed?
I would expect, through you, Mr. Chairman, I would expect that it would be completed by the end of the year. We are hoping to make significant progress on this because we've now staffed up our HR team. And we know what our strategic priorities are, and we just need to align the plan with those strategic priorities.
Just one final question on that. In terms of your HR department, and you said you now have a complement of 5 employees, do you think that's adequate then in terms of what you want to accomplish?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I know it's always easy to say that we need more staff. And when we are invited to comment on questions like this, the tendency is to say, yes, we could certainly do with more staff. I mean, it would clearly help. We would be able to move things along faster, but I am mindful of you know, the need for resources in other areas. And because we've been able to essentially double the size of our HR unit, I'm happy with that for the moment. But again, I just wanted to underscore the point that we have just achieved that. So we have just onboarded these employees, and hence the reason why I say that we can now, I think, make more significant progress on this issue.
Other questions from members on this? Okay. Let's turn next then to the CBC Workforce Plan. No, sorry. The Human Resources Database. And for that, we could turn again to Ms. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to Mr. Clifford. Human Resources Database. In 2019, the Office of the Auditor General reported that Customs did not have a comprehensive human resources database that consolidated all of the HR information for each staff member. We note from your response in December 2021 that you have decided to adopt the government's new human resource management system that was scheduled to be rolled out in January 2022. We're aware that the new HR system, MyVista, has now been rolled out. My question is, what progress has the CBC made with adopting the government's new HR management system?
I thank the member for that question. Before I answer it, Mr. Chairman, I failed to earlier introduce the other two team members that I have here today to support me. So Deputy Director Kevin Walton, who has responsibility for the trade and revenue portfolio, is here. And our Head of Finance, Mrs. Camille Beckford Johnson. So I just wanted to acknowledge their presence because I failed to do so at the beginning. Mr. Chairman, to answer the member's question, the CBC has fully embraced the MyVista platform that the government has launched. And in fact, we were one of the departments that was essentially used at the inauguration of this system to move forward with the implementation. So we are fully on board with this. And as you would have seen in the Auditor General's report, we had intended to move forward with our own system, the HR database system. But when the plans were announced for a central system for application across the entire government, then we took a step back to wait for that, because it wasn't so much a question of us opting into that program. It was a requirement that government agencies should be using this product. So I'm happy to say that we are fully on board and that we're using it.
Mr. Clifford, if I might just follow that up with you, from your own analysis, your CBC's analysis, is that system robust and fit for the purpose of which you need it for? Because I recognize there are vagaries and differences with regard to managing customs and border control as, rather than just, another team or another ministry or stuff. There are some unique issues you have to deal with.
Mr. Chairman, I think it is perhaps early days to answer that question fully, but I believe that based on the advice I've received from our senior HR manager, that the system is adequate for our needs. Now, I had also considered at one point a system that was being developed by the Caribbean Customs Law Enforcement Council that they were offering for other customs agencies in the region. And I had our HR team look at that system as part of the follow-up on these recommendations. And that sort of coincided with the government moving in the direction of centralizing their HR database. And when our HR team looked at it, the recommendation was that we should embrace this system, not just because it was something that was required of government agencies, but they felt that it was at least as good as what was being offered by the Caribbean Customs Law Enforcement Council. So, as I said, it's early days, but we feel fairly confident about it at this point. There may be that we'll have recommendations down the line for some improvements. There may be a need for some specific modules that would be unique to CBC. We're not sure at this point because it's a bit early to say that at this stage.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Mr. Clifford, I'm very pleased to hear that we're actually moving to a central HR management system throughout our government, because that is long in coming. My second question is whether the government's, this new HR management system has the ability to contain comprehensive data on staff qualifications and training needs.
Mr. Chairman, the answer to that, as I understand it, is yes. And the whole issue of qualifications and training database is something that we had discussed internally within Customs even prior to the merger, because it was something that we didn't have. When I came there, I asked, when I took up the post of Collective Customs, I asked that question specifically, and the answer was no. So we didn't have a database that could tell us these are the employees you have with these qualifications and this level of training, etc. We could go to the personal files and determine that, but there was no database that could provide that information readily. So my understanding is that this system does that, so we're happy about that.
So, Mr. Clifford, as you say, it's early days now, so we will wait to hear what the progress is and whether this will satisfy all of the your obligations in the Customs and Border Control unit.
Mr. Chair.
Okay, Mr. Seymour.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning to you, Director Clifford, and your team. Just wanted to ask the question that I think that is probably on everybody's mind nowadays in terms of your staff complement and how many of them are Caymanian. I know in the past, Customs and Immigration, now CBC, was always revered as a place to work for young Caymanians coming out of school and otherwise. Have you seen the interest still there, and do you have a long waiting list of persons who want to work in this honorable establishment, or has that interest weaned away, and do we need to do anything to try to motivate our universities to steer persons toward this career?
Mr. Chairman, I thank the member for that question, and I'm pleased to say that the large majority of employees at CBC are Caymanian. In fact, I think of the 270 plus employees that we have, I believe there are only 2 or perhaps 3 non-Caymanians. In relation to the level of interest in CBC, the level of interest is still very significant, and I'm very pleased to report that when we had the last recruitment exercise, we had over 1,000 applications, and of that number, just over 500 applications were from Caymanians. We had 32 positions available, and I'm pleased to say that we have just onboarded 31 employees, new employees, recruits, and these are all officers who are about to start training, and they're all Caymanian.
Mr. Chair, I just want to thank the director for that answer, and I'm most proud of this. Very near and dear to me, in terms of Customs Immigration, having worked with them for so many years side by side, and I can only wish you all the best in years coming, and I pray that the interest still remains in terms of persons wanting to work in this department.
I too would like to congratulate and thank the director. I'm most impressed with that figure, and that out of 32, 31 were Caymanians that were recruited. So kudos to you and your team. Moving on now to the Customs and Border Control workplace rules. In 2019, the OEG reported that Customs and Border Control needed to strengthen its integrity management by ensuring that its workplace rules include direction on staff, purchase of government property, especially seized or forfeited goods. There is effective and regular rotation of staff, and by adding financial stability of CBC officers to its annual vetting process. From your December 2021 response, we note that CBC has not yet updated the workplace rules. We also noted, that your excuse me. We also noted that your response in December 2021 did not provide an update on the regular rotation of staff. Can Mr. Clifford give us an update on the progress with updating CBC's workplace rules?
Mr. Chairman, I thank the member for that question. On the issue of the workplace rules, there is a specific recommendation in the Auditor General's report which the member referenced. And hence, that's where the recommendation came from. But we recognize that there's a lot more work that needs to be done on our workplace rules. So we're looking at a more comprehensive review of our workplace rules. In relation to the issue of the vetting of employees, I should say that there is some work going on, and it has wider application for other government agencies. We are relying on a part of that process to update our workplace rules in that regard in relation to the vetting. But I should also point out that employees are required to submit an annual conflict of interest or form, register of interest form, and so that's an annual process that we go through. It's not a complete process in this regard in relation to this recommendation, but it does help. And there are different levels of vetting that would be required for different levels of employees. For instance, our intelligence unit, the officers that serve in that unit would be subjected to a completely different level of vetting, which I wouldn't get into in this forum. But I just wanted to mention all of those complexities and the fact that while we're working on this issue, and in fact as recently as Monday of this week in our senior management meeting, we had a discussion on this issue. But we're making progress, and we're going to complete it, I would imagine, in the next probably 3 to 4 months. I just want to make the point that it goes beyond this recommendation. So we're looking at a much wider review of our workplace rules.
Thank you, Mr. Clifford. Can you also update us on the progress of implementing regular staff rotations with your employees?
Right. Thank you very much, member. And through you, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry I didn't address that earlier because I know you raised that in your original question. I'm not sure, Mr. Chairman. Well, let me put it this way. Staff rotations is something that we have always done within legacy customs, and we continue to do within CBC. So we rotate staff at least once a year, and usually twice. We have rotations once a year, but sometimes twice a year. That doesn't mean that all staff members are rotated, but we look at a percentage of staff for rotations on each occasion. And Mr. Chairman, This is in keeping with the World Customs Organization's best practices. So we have been doing this for quite a period of time, and we've shared this with the Auditor General's office. I did rotations earlier this year, and we are likely to do more just ahead of the winter season this year.
Mr. Clifford, can you give us an indication of who within the organization, what groups of people would be subject to the rotation?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, did you say who would be subject?
Yeah, I'm not looking for names, just, what groups of staff would be subject to rotation?
So all staff members are subject to rotation. So when they sign up to work with CBC, they have, as you know, a job description, which essentially requires them to work in any section or unit that they're transferred to. So what we've tried to do, especially with the now merged agency, CBC, we've tried to do smart rotation so that we get that cross-training in as well. Because you would appreciate that we have legacy customs officers and legacy immigration officers who are not that familiar with each other's functions in terms of the detail. And so we've been trying to move staff around incrementally so that we can get that cross-training in. Because while we merged the two agencies on the 1st of February 2019, and I've made this point before, it wasn't too much of a challenge to create the merger in terms of we have a new branded agency in a new uniform, we have a new strategic plan, etc. It is quite another thing to have an operational merger. That takes several years, and when we went down this road, in all of my public utterances, I made the point that a merger of this nature is a multi-year project. All other countries that's undertaken this, the UK, for instance, they're in year 10 or 11, I believe, of their merger. And yes, it's a much larger country, but we face the same issues here, just on a smaller scale. And the UK is in year 10 or 11, I believe, and they haven't completed their merger yet. The United States is in year 13, I believe, and they haven't completed their merger. So the whole issue of the operational, functional merger is, in every sense, a multi-year undertaking. And sometimes, not sometimes, it's always a culture change involved in that process. And I know that all members here are familiar with the change process and how difficult that can be. So there are always going to be challenges, and it's a work in progress as we move forward.
If there are no further questions from members, let's turn our attention now to the IT Modernization Progress. And for that, I'll go to Mr. Rankin.
Thank you, sir. Through you, Mr. Chair. In 2017, the Auditor General's Office had reported that CBC needed to ensure effective project management on its IT Modernization Project. In your response in December 2021, that a specific project manager has not yet been recruited, even though recruitment was planned for 2019. We also noted that the project scope has been extended due to the merger of the Customs and Immigrations Department. However, the cost of the project is now significantly more than originally estimated, and the project has been significantly delayed. In saying that, can you enlighten this hearing the project management arrangements in place for the IT Modernization Project?
Mr. Chairman, I thank the member for that question. And before I get into the specifics of answering the question that the member has asked, Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I just wanted to make a few preliminary comments to put the answer in context. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we had in place at the Legacy Customs Department an IT platform which was known as TRIPS. TRIPS is the acronym for Total Revenue Integrated Processing System. When I came to Customs and as Collector of Customs, I had a number of complaints about this system. The system was constantly crashing. There was also a previous Auditor General's report into government's IT systems, and it identified a number of vulnerabilities from a security point of view in several agencies, and Customs was one of them, and the TRIPS system was certainly responsible for some of those security concerns. So because we had these issues and the constant crashing of the system, we needed to do something about it. Mr. Chairman, in discussions with the Computer Services Department, we decided to move forward with a change. The TRIPS system, when it was acquired, it was a decision to acquire that as an off-the-shelf system. But Computer Services had also around that same time developed some improvements to the system that was being used prior to the introduction of TRIPS, which is the CTSS system, Customs Tariff Support System. I think that's the acronym for Customs Tariff Support System. So Computer Services had done these upgrades, but the department at the time, the management of the department at the time, had decided that rather than going with those upgrades, they should go with the TRIPS system. So I've already outlined the issues we've had with TRIPS. So when we discussed those issues, the Computer Services Department said, look, we had done these upgrades in the past. We can resurrect those and we can put this in place as at least an interim solution to the issues we're having with TRIPS. And the budget was developed around that. We tasked our IT manager with developing the budget, which is where the original budget of $277,000 came from. And I wanted to put it in context because I know there have been public statements about the project cost going from that number to 1.1 million and a 400% increase or whatever it was. But there's a lot more to the story than that, Mr. Chairman, and I've just sort of started to indicate some of the reasons why that has happened. So that original project cost developed by our IT manager was sort of to take us, it was a bridge basically, to take us from the TRIP problems into a system that was stable and reliable, and that we didn't have the security concerns that had been raised in the Auditor General's. We didn't have those concerns anymore. But the project evolved significantly beyond that in terms of the whole concept of the SIMS system, the Customs Information Management System, and the COLS portal. So that whole thing developed during the sort of bridge project, and the project then expanded significantly beyond what that original bridge was. Project costs were increased as a result. Other things have been considered, online payments, etc. And then, of course, we had the merger that we've talked about earlier. So this started with the Customs Department, and now it's continued with the merged agency, the Customs and Border Control Service. What that merger meant was that additional components were added to the project. So all of the immigration stuff that would not have been included in the original project are now included in this project. So the entry and landing components of it, the visa components of it, that's all included in the project at this point. Another important point to make, Mr. Chairman, is that prior to the merger, and I can't explain why this was the case, but the Customs Department and the customs operations and the immigration operations in the sister islands were not reporting to the two legacy agencies. They were reporting to district administration. So it was a separation there that we had to reconcile during the merger. And when we reconciled those separations, and when I say reconcile, it meant that those two agencies were now also merged and fell under the Customs and Border Control Service. as opposed to district administration. So the rollout of the phased upgrades to our IT platforms that we're doing here had to then include the sister islands, which also wasn't included in the original project. So these are all contributing factors to the cost, going from the original project cost to what we expect the project will cost in the end, Mr. Chairman. So I just wanted to say that without putting that context out there, it can seem misleading when you say that the project has gone from the original $277,000 to over $1 million. I just wanted to make sure that for the listening public's benefit, that they understand that this project is significantly different today than how it started.
Thank you, Director Clifford. That answers certainly spread some light on some of the other questions I was going to ask you. When do you estimate this project will be completed, including the trade and the revenue modules?
Mr. Chairman, we think that the project should be substantially completed by the end of this year. There may be a little spillover into 2023, but that's more about timing. We spoke already in relation to other recommendations about the impact that COVID-19 has had on some of our other projects, and this was certainly one of them. So some components of this project may spill into the first quarter, the early part of the first quarter of 2023, but that would not represent additional cost. We would be looking then to move the money that's not spent in this financial year into 2023 to complete the project.
Thank you, sir. What do you estimate the final cost of the project will be? And for the additional costs, did you get approvals for those?
Mr. Chairman, I think the question was what we estimate the total project cost to be. Mr. Chairman, the answer to that is $2.5 million. And there is, the money is already budgeted for that. So the $1.5 million is budgeted in this, 1.25, sorry, is budgeted in the current financial year.
And final two questions. What lessons do you think Customs and Border Control has learned from this IT project, and the value for money aspects of this new IT system?
Mr. Chairman, I think with any project of this magnitude and nature, lessons are going to be learned. I've explained how we started with this project. It wasn't something that we had necessarily planned for. So to say that this was something that we had sat down and looked at for a number of years and then embarked on the project, if it had been that kind of scenario, then part of that planning would have included putting a project manager in place. We didn't have a project manager, and that's one of the things that if we had to do this over again, and if we had the time, because we know that this was sort of something that became a necessity given the circumstances and wasn't necessarily something that we were expecting. But if we had had the time and the ability to plan better for this, then we would have had a project manager in place from the beginning. I took a decision very early in this project because the focus of the initial phase of the project was on the portfolio of trade and revenue, which, as I indicated earlier, falls to Mr. Walton, Mr. Kevin Walton. So Mr. Walton had been given the task from the very beginning to project manage this for us on behalf of CBC, with the support, of course, of the Computer Services Department, because we had been working hand in hand with them. And Mr. Chairman, I just want to say that while this is not Mr. Walton's only responsibility, he has a much wider remit, and he was sort of, as I said, our de facto project manager for this project. He has done an excellent job, in my view, given the limited resources and the compressed time frame within which he had to get this project launched and underway. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to publicly thank Deputy Director Kevin Walton. And of course, he has been through this whole process ably supported by our head of finance, Mrs. Beckford Johnson. So I wanted to take the opportunity to thank both of them for the work that they've done on this. I believe I may have failed to answer the specific question earlier about the project manager, Mr. Chairman. We are in the process now of making significant progress on that issue, because the project manager will not just manage this project, but other aspects of our operations as well. But I wanted to mention that while we had hoped to achieve this a lot earlier, it's important to point out that we didn't actually have a budget for the project manager until this budget cycle. What we had tried to do before was to onboard a project manager using what we term managed vacancies. So we were looking at how we could not fill certain positions and redirect that funding to the project manager post. That didn't happen for a number of reasons, Mr. Chairman. There were competing factors, and sometimes you have to, as I said, reset your priorities, and so it didn't happen. But the important point I want to make is that we didn't actually have a budget for a project manager until this budget cycle.
Thank you, sir. And I too want to place on record at least my personal thanks for the work that you guys have been doing, especially Deputy Walton and the financial officer. So thank you for all what you guys have been doing.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Clifford, I think part of the question he also asked about the value for money of the project itself, and your views on that, whether you feel that at the end of the day, is government going to end up with and CBC going to end up with a finished product that's going to provide real value for the money that we spent on it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm very confident that at the end of this project, we will be able to say that we have achieved value for money. I think it's clear, Mr. Chairman. I have been involved in many, as you know, in many regional meetings with other customs agencies. I sit on the executive committee of the Caribbean Customs Law Enforcement Council, and we know that they're off-the-shelf products. There's a product called Asacuda that a lot of islands across the Caribbean use. Some of them use the same TRIPS system that we have now abandoned. And so I have heard the complaints from all of those countries about the issues, many issues that they've had with these off-the-shelf products. We believe, Mr. Chairman, that because we have designed this product for our operations, that it is fit for purpose. We will own the product, own and control the product. And Mr. Chairman, I don't want to say too much about it at this point, but I'm confident that we're going to get value for money from this. And it could be, just given the complaints that I've mentioned from many other countries around the region, that this is a product that could represent some additional revenue for us going forward if we're able to attract the attention from other countries who may see this as an alternative to the systems that they're using now. Thank you, sir.
Any other questions on this area? Okay, let's turn next to revenue concessions, and for that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Bodden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Clifford. Revenue concessions. In 2019, the Office of the Auditor General reported that Customs had no means of tracking concessions and recommended that Customs and Border Control should develop an approach to ensure that it can monitor concessions effectively. We note from your response in December 2021 that implementation of this recommendation is awaiting the Ministry of Financial Economic Development's finalization of a concessions policy, we are aware is not yet in place. Can the director then let us know the process for monitoring concessions in the absence of a policy and any related challenges?
Mr. Chairman, I thank the member for that question. Mr. Chairman, when decisions are made in Cabinet about concessions, the extract from the Cabinet's decision is sent to the department for implementation, and that extract would normally contain the details of the concession. So those details could include what products, if it's a project, for instance, the details could include what products the concessions are applicable to, over what time frame, etc. And those are things that we look at in terms of monitoring. I shouldn't say monitoring, but ensuring compliance with the concessions. Mr. Chairman, very early in the process of the discussion on concessions, we were involved in that, and we had our own recommendations in relation to the concessions policy, because sometimes we have to ask for clarification on concessions if things are not clear, and that's not the ideal situation. So we do the best that we can with the information that we have available to us. If we think we need clarification on something, we will certainly seek it. But we follow the decisions in Cabinet very, very carefully, and usually these concessions have an end date, and that would be flagged in our system so that the concessions wouldn't extend beyond that. But we are certainly looking forward to the finalization of the concessions policy.
Thank you, Mr. Clifford. I know it's in capable hands. Thank you to you and your staff.
Mr. Chair, through you to Mr. Clifford. Earlier today, when we had the Financial Secretary here, I spoke about the tax gap. And there were certainly some gaps in some of his reporting because of information he didn't have. Are you, Customs itself, keeping track of this kind of information in regards to the tax gap?
Mr. Chairman, it's kind of a broad question, but what we've tried to do is to fill as many of the gaps as we possibly can. I know that the ministry has been engaged in some work on this. I believe that the concessions policy will help to establish things like what the annual cap is in relation to concessions. And I also believe that will help to inform the information that the ministry and the committee is trying to determine with respect to the tax gap. So it's a bit challenging for us because we will put in place projections for revenue on an annual basis for the purpose of budgeting. And that's often based on a combination of historical information in relation to revenues collected, performance of key sectors like tourism and financial services, and whether there are any significant government policies that might impact those projections. So that's what we do, and we do that on every occasion during the the preparation of the budget. But sometimes we don't know when we're doing those projections the value of the concessions that will be granted during that particular budget period. And because we don't know the value, it could cause our projections to be inaccurate at the end of that financial cycle when we're looking at actuals. So I don't know that we can answer beyond that. It's a bit of a challenge for us at the moment, and we provide information that we do to the ministry for them to try to determine that gap.
Deputy Auditor General.
Thank you. If I can just, for clarification purposes, Mr. Clifford, you mentioned earlier in your response that you monitored the concessions that were already in place. And Mr. Rankin mentioned that we heard from the Financial Secretary this morning about measuring the tax gap, which is revenues that are foregone. So in the past, not looking forward to the future. Obviously, you don't know what concessions Cabinet are going to award in the future. But just for clarity, the FS responded that the information that is in the Q1 report it reports only on those import duties that the Ministry of Finance controls. And some of those are obviously are within CBC. So can you clarify that you can put a figure on the value of revenues foregone in the financial year 2021 or for the first quarter of 2022? I think that's what the committee are trying to establish.
Mr. Chairman, so when I said that we monitor the concessions, I sort of clarified that, if you remember, during my answer. We try our best to manage the concessions at CBC, so we manage them from the point of view of ensuring that the concessions are granted in accordance with Cabinet's decision. With respect to the specifics of the foregone revenue, Mr. Chairman, I just crave your indulgence for a minute while I consult with our head of finance on that issue. So, Mr. Chairman, we currently do report on foregone revenue. It's being done manually now, but it's being built into the system, the IT platform that we discussed earlier. So in terms of enhancements, that will be one of them. But we are currently reporting on foregone revenue on an annual basis.
I just want maybe just try and that seeks a little further clarity here, Director. If Cabinet gives a concession to a developer, for argument's sake, Cabinet gives a concession of, say, $2 million in import duties on building materials to develop a project A. Does CBC monitor it to the extent that they can track those revenues foregone so that they know that the developer does not benefit more than what Cabinet has authorized?
Mr. Chairman, the answer to that is yes. So we do that, certainly.
Thank you. No other questions from the committee on this? Okay, then let's move on to the capture and analysis of intelligence. And for that, we turn to Mr. Seymour.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In 2019, the Auditor General's report, the need for Customs and Border Control to ensure that it had appropriate systems and processes to capture analyze and use intelligence effectively. We note from your February 2022 response that the implementation of the recommendation was postponed due to a shift in priorities. Mr. Chair, I would like to ask the Director for an updated timeline for the implementation of the recommendation.
Mr. Chairman, I thank the member for the question. Let me say, Mr. Chairman, that the 5-year strategic plan that we just implemented in January this year, the whole foundation of that plan is to complete the transition of the department from what used to be the gatekeeper's approach to the intelligence-led risk management approach. So what that means, Mr. Chairman, is that we need to, because that's the foundation of the plan, we need to make sure that our intelligence unit is properly structured, resourced to achieve that goal, essentially. Mr. Chairman, we have systems in place for the gathering of information and dissemination of information to the relevant units within CBC and beyond to our partner law enforcement agencies. And of course, those arrangements are reciprocal. So those systems have been in place for some time now. But I mentioned the restructuring of our intelligence unit so that it is fit for purpose, because that is one of the very early objectives that we need to complete under our strategic plan. Work is significantly underway with that, and we have had the benefit of a secondee from the UK Border Force who has been on island for a year now. He's about to depart, and we've also had an assessment done by 2 UK analysts on our intelligence unit. And I'm pleased to report, Mr. Chairman, that the report was very positive and that we are moving forward with our restructured intelligence unit. And I say all of that to say that included in this whole process is moving forward with whatever improvements we need to undertake in terms of the gathering and dissemination of information and intelligence. And Mr. Chairman, I should also tie this into the fact that the SIMS platform that we've discussed quite a bit this morning will also play an integral role in the direction that we're moving with our intelligence unit and our intelligence products, because the system that we have developed and that we continue to expand includes risk management modules, which helps us significantly with intelligence and targeting of not just passengers but cargo.
Mr. Chair, just wanted to follow up with if the Director could give me an estimate. I don't think he mentioned an estimated timeline. Is it a year or 6 months, or estimate in terms of?
Mr. Chairman, thank the member for that question. As I said, we've already made quite a bit of progress on this issue. I wouldn't say that we're going to complete this in 6 months' time or in a year's time, because the truth of the matter is this is an ongoing project. It's not going to end because we're continuously upgrading our products and our systems. We're getting involved in other intelligence sharing arrangements regionally and internationally. So it's not a project that we can say it's for 1 year and it's done and over. And that's not unique to the Cayman Islands. That would be the case with an intelligence service, I would imagine, anywhere in the world. So it is ongoing.
Mr. Chair, I want to thank the Director for for that clarity and at least for the listening public's benefit. Thank you very much. And also, I think that ends my line of questioning, and I want to take this opportunity to thank the director for the wonderful job they're doing there at CBC, Mr. Charles Clifford, and his assistant deputy director, Mr. Walton, and Mrs. Beckford Johnson, who's known to me as Camille, for the wonderful job that they're doing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions from the committee? Okay, thank you. Mr. Clifford, that concludes the questioning. Appreciate your presence here and that of your top team with you this morning. Thank you for your candidness with answering questions that have been put to you. You're excused at this time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank members for their questions.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chief Officer Howell. Welcome to this hearing of the Public Accounts Committee. Just as a reminder to you, although I know you're well rehearsed as well, but when you make your first answer to a question, if you just state your name and your position before you answer for the record. But just by way of preamble, Mr. Howell, it's been 3 years since the Office of the Auditor General report on customs in the Cayman Islands was published. The report included 15 recommendations. PAC endorsed them all and made 5 of its own. All 20 recommendations were accepted, and 9 were directed to Customs and Border Control. We note that CBC has implemented 4 of the recommendations, partly implemented 2, and has made little or no progress of the remaining 3. While we welcome that some progress has been made, we note that the Auditor General assessed CBC's progress as amber, some progress. We have discussed CBC's latest responses to the recommendations with the Director, just prior to your entry, and we would like to further discuss a few of the responses with you. The first area we want to examine with you and question you on is the IT Modernization Project. And to that, I'm going to turn things over to a member of the committee, Mr. Rankin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Mr. Howell. In the previous session of this PAC hearing, we spoke to the CBC Director in regards to the IT Modernization Project. And in that 2017 report, the OAG spoke about the need for effective project management for this IT Modernization Project, and the Director did elaborate quite a bit on that. The Auditor General spoke about the project's cost, which is now significantly more than it started out at, and it has been significantly delayed. And again, the Director explained some of those things, but what I would like to ask is, what was the Ministry's oversight of the IT Modernization Project, And can you elaborate on the funding for the IT projects and the cost overruns from the minister's perspective?
Good morning. A couple of minutes left in the morning. Wesley Howell, Chief Officer for the Ministry of Border Control and Labour. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank the member for the question, and through you, sir. The Ministry does take IT projects quite significantly. The Cayman Islands relies heavily on imports for everything from fuel for electricity to food and baby formula and all these other things that are issues for us. So an efficient functioning Customs and Border Control agency not only benefits the government, but benefits the country. And the IT systems are a way that they can keep pace with the levels of imports and the complexity of their work in relation to concessions and differing tariffs and those things without exponentially increasing their staffing levels. So what I can say is that there was work that started more on an ad hoc basis within Customs. They were utilizing technical expertise within government's computer services department as well as outside IT consultants and developers. And the process was evolving as we transitioned through to Customs and Border Control and into the current financial years, talking 2022, 2023 now, the issues of spend on capital are all required to be framed with a business case outlining what is being delivered, for what purpose, what are the timelines, what's the full cost, and when it will be completed, who will be doing it. All those answers needs to be provided before we then do our onward consolidated submission of a budget through to the minister and on to caucus and cabinet and ultimately finance committee and the parliament. So we have implemented and insisted that CBC complete business cases on their work. If we were able to rewind the clock and go back to the days when Customs started their work, if that was done, I don't think we would be discussing cost overruns, because we would have been able to portion the project in such a way that it had a finite start and a finite end and a finite deliverable. What we're looking at is a project that has evolved over the years and taken on more capability, more development in different areas that weren't originally envisioned within the initial cost, and such the cost increase. Similarly, the functionality increased as well. So our work now really is to ensure that we can document properly and then be able to ensure that we're getting value for money. We're hitting the IT projects on the areas that are most painful and deliver the most benefit for the country and for the government.
Mr. Howell, what are the lessons the minister will learn from this particular IT project?
Thank you, sir, for the question. Through you, Mr. Chairman. The first lesson is we ought not to start a project unless we've formally documented what it is. The project sponsor, we've scoped it, we've costed it, and we give it a definite start and end date. That way we can then hold folks accountable for saying, you know, you got sent to the store to buy a bottle of milk and a bag of sugar. If you come back with some salt beef and some other things, you've bought more, you spent more. Was that in scope? So if we had done that at the beginning, the Auditor General's report would have been much different, because we would have been able to close off that particular initial project, spin up a new project with new funding requests, a new justification, and therefore be able to go forward. There is no doubt that the work that has been done by Mr. Clifford and his team has benefited the country. I can remember sitting in previous finance committees and public accounts committees being asked, what are we doing about the delays on clearing goods and people can't get their equipment to run their operations and those things. I don't get those questions anymore, even though our imports are as high or as they've ever been. the systems are working and the folks are being able to keep up with the increased demand, even more so now that our borders have reopened and staff that we had redeployed from airport operations, i.e. passenger, were deployed to cargo to help deal with the increases in cargo that happened during the lockdown period. They're now going back to the airports, and the numbers are increasing, but we're able to cope now with that because IT systems are that much more flexible. Once we get to the point that payments can be made online, not just by the brokers who use the bond system, but persons using credit cards and escrow accounts, and those are online and processing, we will see even more benefits from that. So from a cost perspective, we're talking $2 million. From a revenue perspective, CBC collects $200 million. So if we can collect that money more effectively and report more effectively on it, ensure that persons aren't skimping on their revenue by using intelligence to analyze invoices and look at trends, then we are protecting the government's purse, and that's a primary focus for Customs and Border Control.
Thank you very much, Mr. Howell.
Members have other questions on this? Okay. Let's turn next now to the CBC Workforce Plan. Until that, we turn to Ms. Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to Mr. Howell. Good afternoon. My question is, well, actually, let me just pose the preamble here and then I'll ask the question. In 2019, the Auditor General's Office reported that Customs did not have a workplace plan setting out what staffing it needs to deliver its objectives and goals. The Director did give us a pretty comprehensive indication of what is being the work that's being carried out, to include the fact that his HR unit now is fully complemented with employees to carry out this plan. From your perspective as the Chief Officer in the Ministry, can you provide what progress and an indicative time frame or time scale for developing this workplace plan?
Thank you, member, for that question. Through you, Mr. Chairman, I can say that well, let me start at the beginning. So the border control aspect of immigration and customs merged and became effective on the 1st of February 2019. A year later, we were facing an imminent shutdown from COVID. The amount of progress that CBC has managed to make over that period to date is phenomenal, in that these folks can't do their work from home. They're on the front lines. They were there clearing cargo, securing our borders, operating those repatriation flights, keeping us secure and ensuring that we got our goods. So the fact that we made any progress at all during that very difficult process for our frontline officers and staff is tremendous. And I'd like to thank Mr. Clifford and his team publicly for all that they did through that, because they were physically and otherwise on the front lines of what we were doing. So I'm pleased to say that during that time, they were able to develop, using in-house resources management support unit from POCS, a comprehensive strategic plan which spans 5 years, so it's 2022, adjusted because we had the COVID issues. It covers all of the areas, including the new areas that we didn't even think about when we had the merger, including things like anti-money laundering and terrorist financing and terrorism issues. So those are new portfolios that have been spun up within CBC to satisfy our international obligations to ensure that we're doing those things right there. CBC has a great reputation as a place to work, or their recruitment exercises usually end up with 5 to 1, 10 to 1 persons applying for a particular post, and I'm really pleased to see that we have Caymanians coming back with criminology degrees, some of them with masters that are wanting to get into customs and border control. So the plan does cover a multi-year approach to human resources. We work very closely with them and our minister in relation to funding positions, and it just went through a major recruitment exercise. That training begins on Monday. I'm looking forward to that. I always enjoy speaking to new officers when they start their training. But it is key. I have also challenged Mr. Clifford and his team to look seriously at succession planning for their senior positions. I myself joined the civil service. Should I come in to be 35 years? So we're in a age group that within the next 10 years will all be retiring, and a number of the senior managers in CBC will be retiring. So there's a specific ask around succession planning, professional development, how are we going to train and develop junior officers to take the ranks going up, which officers can be put on fast track promotion aspects to ensure that those with the most promise and the most abilities get to be able to utilize their skills faster. And I dare say that's being done on all three islands, because Cayman Brac now is included within the umbrella of Mr. Clifford's portfolio. So it is part of their strategic plan. I've also tasked them myself in relation specifically to senior management succession planning.
Thank you, Mr. Howell, and I'm happy to hear about the succession planning, because we are going to be in big trouble if we don't provide that upward progression for our employees and to take over various managerial positions. Mr. Clifford did say that the time frame, he was trying to have this plan completed by the end of this year. Is that, are you also in agreement with that time frame?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I think that time frame is definitely achievable. If I rewind back to 2017, 2018, when customs and immigration staff were working on the pre-merger issues, they flagged, first of all, they worked side by side, even though they were wearing different uniforms and reporting to different ministries, different chief officers. But they flagged a number of issues that needed to be sorted out: pay inequity, skill gaps, training, professional development, core courses. A number of those issues are already in flight. So I can say that the classes that graduated in 2019, the first set that came out in 2019, officers were cross-trained in both traditional immigration law and customs law as well. And that cross-training was visible when we were able to redeploy airport staff from doing passport control and checkpoint 2, which is the customs aspect, and put them on the revenue side and have them operate within that very fluidly, because they understood the separate pieces of legislation. So that thankfully is already underway, and every new class that we have these officers that are coming out that no longer identify as I was a former customs officer, I was a former immigration officer. They're now CBC officers from day one. We have officers like Mr. Wong, who is responsible for traditional immigration functions and traditional customs functions as well, now with teams cross-training. So I can say that that's on the way. The actual plan and implementation, that is something that we're tasking them with. They report monthly to me on HR issues and plans and those things. So I will do my best to hold their fingers to the fire to ensure that the year-end time frame is achievable.
You can go. You can proceed with the other
Okay.
final section.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The final section that we're going to question you on is on the human resources database. Mr. Howell. Here again, the director did give us the comprehensive report on that, but from your perspective as the Chief Officer in the ministry, we'd like to ask you one or two questions as well. The OEG reported that Customs did not have a comprehensive human resources database. And you know what that's like. You were in IT, you're in computer services, so you know what that means in terms of when you don't have a central database. That database consolidated all the HR information for each staff member. We are now aware that the new HR system, MyVista, has now been rolled out. So from your perspective, what the CBS, can you indicate what progress has been made with adopting the government's new HR management system?
Thank you for the question again, through you, Mr. Chairman. I have to say before I start, I have huge respect and congratulations to my colleague, Chief Officer Gloria Matfield-Nixon. The MyVista project had some incredibly tight timelines and was quite far-reaching, and her team managed to pull it off and get the system implemented and up and running. I was one of the project steering committee members on that, but I did none of the heavy lifting, so I can't take any of the credit at all. As part of the pre-merger and post-merger exercises, I mentioned earlier that there were salary inequities between officers that were customs officers and officers that were immigration officers. One of the things that Mr. Clifford and his team did, Ms. Simone Mamby, who was their HR manager, they compiled a compendium of all of the qualification of their employees. So anybody did an associate's degree, master's degree, initial degree, if they've done specific training such as AML, intelligence, and they used formulas then to apply those skills and experience along with education to come up with an equitable means of assessing salary scale and point as officers sort of merged into the salary scales. That information, I'm happy to know now, will be able to feed into MyVista. The MyVista system as it is now will take recruitment from the time somebody applies and enters their information, and that if they're successful, that will flow into their employee record. So I've looked through mine, and it captures significant amounts of my data, but more importantly, from an accountability perspective, it also tracks things like leave, which can be a nightmare to manage in a operation that works essentially 24/7 when you consider the port operations. So I'm happy to say that the MyVista is up and running. It's tracking leave, it's tracking comp time and those issues, as well as sort of cradle to grave in relation to from the time somebody applies for a job until they retire. The MyVista system sort of manages that all the way through. So CBC now has, as the rest of core government and some of the SAGCs, the ability to use a holistic system that manages everything, including payroll, from one platform.
So, Mr. Howell, this database for tracking qualifications, leave, and what have you, is this database now available throughout the government, in all the ministries?
I am not certain that all of the ministries have adopted the MyVista and transitioned from the systems that they were running. Our ministry has. We took the decision that we were going to do that. So it came online, I think, the 1st of February. So we transitioned all of the leave and accruals that we had from January into MyVista so that we would have a complete year in one system. We wouldn't have to run parallel system. So I can't speak for other ministries, but across our ministry, we took the decision that we're going to use MyVista exclusively for managing those things going forward.
And from your experience in IT, you're pleased with what this is producing?
No, absolutely. The whole process, processing payroll, the recruitment process alone is a significant time saver in relation to acknowledging applications, producing shortlists, responding to candidates, and then tracking leave, vacation, timekeeping. It's all inclusive. So I am quite pleased.
Well, I will give a recommendation here today that if this is successful, the whole government should be taking this on, because, you know, that's an easy out in terms of manual way of doing things, you know. So that is my recommendation to Ms. Gloria.
Mr. Chairman, I can say, I mean, we spend as much time answering HR queries during our annual audit as we do answering financial queries. So leave accruals, comp time used, all those things become major issues that could possibly lead us to qualification. So the fact that we now have a system that helps to keep that all in train is wonderful from our perspective. I'm sure the OEG office considers the same as well, because it is a risk factor because the costs are significant.
Mr. Howell, just can you give the committee a flavour for the amount of effort in terms of human resource and time consumed in order to make that transition to this new system?
So from our perspective, we've had our HR teams across the ministry working collectively. Our chief HR manager has been working well, but Ms. Gloria Matfield-Nixon had a team of persons across the board, as well as some key members of our staff who did nothing else but MyVista implementation. And there were a number of key deadlines that had to be met to ensure that we could transition payroll across and all those things. So I don't have the numbers for all that went into that. That's Chief Officer Matfield-Nixon, but I can say that she did manage to pull together a team that had IT security persons, IT experts inside and outside of government, as well as HR folks and other persons that were all sort of stakeholders working towards this common goal.
I do appreciate that. What I was looking more for is from your experience as Chief Officer and your ministry moving onto this new system in terms of the effort that in order to get there and get you on there, because you said it was rolled out in February and, you know, we're here in May, and you said that you're now fully on board with the system.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for clarification. So the MyVista system actually came with preloaded key information on a number of our employees. The decision that we had to take were things around leave accruals and comp time and those issues. And then when we transitioned to time recording and took that decision. So for us, because we didn't want to have to report on two systems come year end, we decided that we would manually port our information from our current leave tracking system across to MyVista. So that exercise may have been some additional work over a couple of weeks for our staff to do, but not significant. The switchover was there, but the POCS team did do their work in relation to pulling forward pay scales and start dates and those key things that go into building out the HR system, and those were preloaded for us.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Seymour.
Thank you. Just want to ask the Chief Officer, to pique my interest to ask, did we lose any personnel in terms of human resources because of the merger of Immigration and Customs, of persons who were employed in each individual department that couldn't adapt?
Mr. Chairman, not specifically. There have been significant change within the Immigration Department that was pre-merger in the senior leadership. Mr. Clifford was incoming Collector of Customs recently since preceding the merger. And again, within the senior leadership of Customs, there were changes that preceded the integration. But no, not significantly. What we are seeing, though, is really an overall aging civil service, and a number of persons are retiring, whether that be early retirement or otherwise. And some of my most difficult conversations are having with individuals who we haven't properly planned for their replacement, and their skill sets are such that, I'm trying to talk them out of going on their retirement plans to stay around for another year or two to help transition in new resources to take over from them. But from a merger perspective, a place was found for everyone within the two agencies, and folks have benefited from wider portfolios and being able to move around from one area to the next.
Mr. Chair, through you, sir, has there been any immediate discussions with UCCI or ICCI in terms of trying to recruit?
Mr. Chairman, recruitment is particularly for CBC officers is not a challenge for the department. Their challenge is actually sifting through the application to select the best candidates for interview and onward promotion. So it is very challenging. I mean, if I was to speak directly to young persons who have an interest in law enforcement, you need to know that it's a competitive environment. Even within our Cayman population, our young people are coming back with degrees in criminology, criminal justice, other law enforcement, accounting. We've had persons come back with law that want to go into law enforcement through CBC. So it would be take advantage of all those areas of professional development and learning and know that you need that to apply, because it is getting more competitive. So the chances of someone coming out of high school with a high school degree only and being the successful candidate for a CBC officer is quite low, because they have so many well-qualified Caymanians applying that they would be the more qualified candidates.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. The reason why I asked that question is because of the high rate of persons that are ready for retirement, and a lot of these persons that are ready for retirement are senior management. So I wanted to ensure that were able to immediately employ some of the skills that were needed to fast track managers to take over. In some cases, we got 5 years left. In some cases, we got 10 years. And I know it took some time for the senior managers that we have now to get up to speed in terms of the maturity that it takes to run such a department.
Mr. Chairman, through you, totally agree with the members, sir. And again, that's one of the reasons why the succession plan, particularly at the senior management levels, is one of the things that I'm holding CBC firm to, because that needs to be planned over multiple periods of time. I can say that one of the significant challenges for CBC in most of our law enforcement areas is hanging on to compliance staff. The whole international compliance arena has made it that those staff members are extremely valuable and sought after. So we can't compete with private sector salaries. So we get people and we train them up, and they have a couple of years of experience and they're off. And I congratulate them for moving on. And for them, it's really good. For us, it becomes a sort of a cycle where we're having to replace those. But those persons are going on to be head of compliance and compliance partners and other things in the private sector. I'm sure the OAG's office has the same struggle when it comes to recruiting and maintaining that caliber of persons. But because we have that mandate to deliver on money laundering and anti-terrorism financing, those officers have specific training and specific skill sets that are being sought after worldwide, but especially so in the Cayman Islands.
Mr. Chair, I just want to note that I am not ashamed that we're creating such valuable staff.
Thank you, sir. Any other line of questioning from members of the committee? Okay. Mr. Howell, that concludes the committee's questioning of you in terms of the Auditor General's report. I thank you for attending this morning and for your candid responses to all the questions. I wish you a pleasant afternoon, sir, and thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd also like to thank the Auditor General's Office for the work that they do and ensuring that they keep us on our toes, because it helps us to deliver better for the people of Cayman Islands. So thank you, sir, and your committee as well.
That's what this process is all about, too. Thank you, sir. Members of the committee, this concludes this morning's session of the Public Accounts Committee. We will take the lunch break at this time. I do note that we are running about 25 minutes behind schedule. So we had planned to be back here at 1 o'clock, and I would like to try and stick to that as close as we can. But we have a couple of things to do in the lunch break as well. So let's take the break for lunch, and we certainly want to be back here as close to 1 o'clock as we can. Okay? Thank you all.